Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tory Stevens. I'm here with Grist and Fix. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with Fix Grist Solutions Lab, and we're having a How We're Fixin' It event, which is an event that's focused on the climate solutionaries in our network. We call them fixers. And, I'm going to do some housekeeping first. The first thing I want to say is if you haven't dropped where you're from in wherever you're beaming in from, if you're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, wherever, I still think it's neat to be able to put where you're from. So just drop where you're from. If you're here on Crowdcast, do that. It's just exciting to see where everyone is beaming in from. So this series that we've launched and ran a few of these now is focused on the bright spots, right? So what are the bright spots in the climate solutions movement? So we invite our fixers to talk about the really great things that they're bringing into the world. We definitely think that, we have a goal out there, a mission. We want to switch the narrative in the climate solution space, one that is hopeful, one that is focused on a future that is clean, green, and just. And so we're going to be talking with a few folks today. I'll introduce them in a moment about that. So this series is just really, really about you, the audience, learning about climate solutions, right? We often talk about the climate crisis and all the problems that are happening, but we want to take a moment to talk about the solutions and like the hopefulness that can get us out of this crisis. So, my name is Tory Stevens. I've been at Fix for about 3 years now, and my main role is a network weaver. It's an interesting title, a fun one, but it's mainly about bringing people together, right? Building relationships, and so that we do that in public spaces like this, live events that could be on virtual or when pre-COVID, kind of like on stage and whatnot. But we also have private events where we bring our community together to talk about these things. So those things happen a lot, and we're always like, whoa, let's bring the audience into this, because like we can't just be having these insular conversations, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to introduce the folks that are on the panel today. And so we have Dawn Lippert, who is at Elemental Accelerator. We have Sara Chandler, who is there as well. I should back up and just say that Dawn is the CEO of Elemental Accelerator, and Sara Chandler is the Managing Director of Equity and Access. And then we also have Cameron, who is a partner of theirs. The conversation's mainly going to be focused on Elemental Accelerator, but also their partners, because the conversation and what we're going to be talking about is about community. It's about doing this together. So we're pulling these folks together. And then we also have Nancy Ibrahim, who's at Esperanza Community Housing. And so we're all just going to talk about and have a conversation and unpack what Elemental Accelerator does. This bringing folks together in like a global way, which is quite impressive, but in a hyper local way at the same time. And I don't have even though I've been working with them for a while via the fixers, I want to understand that better. Like, why do they bring entrepreneurs, in businesses, in community with frontline folks, right? So they're going to talk about that and unpack that in a lot better way than I can. That's why we've invited them here, so that you can learn. So the last thing I'll say is when we're in conversation with them, you can put some questions into the chat or use the ask a question button. And then we'll have we'll answer some of the questions at the end of this discussion. Mm-hmm. So the one thing I also want to get across is like the mission of this organization. And so that I nail it, I'm actually going to read it. So let me do that. So the organization, Elemental Accelerator, is on a mission to redesign the systems at the root of climate change. by funding first of its kind projects for climate technologies in real communities. So that's pretty much their ethos. And, I talked about this global and local community and frontline and bringing together entrepreneurs. So, Dawn, can you talk about this piece? Like, why is it important for entrepreneurs, someone who's entering the market, to care and think about frontline communities? I mean, I think I have seen many businesses who just kind of move, they break things. I think there's like this mantra in like the tech world to kind of like, fail fast. But I don't really think that that's your model at all. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I love that you brought up that question of speed, because I think, we do have urgency around the challenge that we're all facing with climate. But one thing I definitely learned from Hawaii is go slow to go fast. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means to us too, but I think it's important to bring up that question of speed. So maybe just to frame it for a moment, thank you so much for having us. Really excited to be in conversation with this group of people today and see some friends from all the way from New Zealand to New York, all over the world, who are really deeply either working on this work with us or are really here for the first time. So welcome. I think one thing to sort of think about as we think about this question of technology and community and how they intersect is that we're going to need between $2 and $10 trillion of investment per year in climate to decarbonize our systems, right? So this is the biggest sort of shift, an economic shift that we will see in our lifetimes. It's akin to the Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution, and now coming up on the decarbonization revolution. And while we're seeing a lot of capital come into that space, we now have about $500 billion a year last year across the space invested into decarbonization solutions. We're starting to see a lot of capital move in that way. What we have realized working in about a dozen years in these climate solutions in communities is that those technology solutions that are being funded by those large dollar amounts, they can only ever bring half the solution. You can invent new technologies, you can think of new things, you can come with creative business models to deploy things, wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, all these things that we need on the technology side. That brings half the solution. And the community, where all of these things will be deployed, the community brings the other half of the solution. And the community is actually deeply underfunded in this space and under-resourced to be able to support the deployment and scale up of the technologies that we need. So community organizations received far less than $9 billion last year in funding. And what this means is there's just this really real and actually growing imbalance between the amount of dollars and funding going into the solutions that need to be deployed and the communities that will ultimately host and determine the success of these solutions. Mm-hmm. And so we've been thinking a lot about how to help rebalance that system and close that gap. And about 12 years ago, I started Elemental, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. And the idea is really to get deep into that, closing that gap in an on-the-ground, really tangible way. It's not necessarily focused on sort of white papers and thinking about this, but actually funding projects, funding the companies that are going to be building all of that infrastructure in the future, which many of them are startups now, but across the last decade or more, we've funded 136 companies. Cameron's Allume is one of them, one of the portfolio companies. And these are going to be the big companies building all this climate infrastructure of the future. So what we're really interested in Elemental is, can you actually build this DNA and competency and entire approach of working with community partners into the business early, so that as these companies scale, as these climate technologies scale, we're actually scaling the community solutions too, in a way that financially makes sense and that from a people infrastructure makes sense. So that's the thesis of what we're working on at the nonprofit and really trying to fill that gap.
Mm-hmm. That's really beautiful. Like, and also it just the scaling justice and equity is not something I hear about often, and especially in the space of like when business leaders and entrepreneurs and whatnot. I when I was introducing you, so I want to move this question over to Sarah because like when I was introducing you, and this kind of goes at the heart of what you're trying to do. So DEIJ, diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice is like huge, and it has been for a while. But like many companies are focused on this. But I noticed with Sarah that it's in your title. Like, so this means that elemental is like this is at the highest levels. This is like important. Often, DEIJ is regulated to like a committee, right? It's not like there might not even be like a paid position of it. So I just want to like talk about what it's like. What does that mean to you, and like why do you have this title next to kind of like let me just read your title exactly. Managing Director of Equity and Access. Like I don't see that at the highest levels at many organizations. So I just wanted you to talk about that role a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. I could unpack that for hours, but I will try to keep it brief. I think this conversation, honestly, really explains what I feel my role is about and how Elemental operates. We're extremely interdisciplinary. I mean, what other sector do you have affordable housing advocates, startups, investors in the same conversation? And you need us all here to have a holistic conversation and one that gets directly at the issues. And I could talk about my title. I think what's really crucial is keeping equity and access top of mind in our work and centering folks that are going to be impacted the most by climate. And climate change is, it's impacting us all, but it's deeply personal for all of us and for those especially being impacted today. And those who are have had to navigate historically and through systemic inequity and racism, and it's impacted our health and well-being. And so, it's important to talk about the challenges of doing this work across our sectors and why those challenges exist, why it's hard to build trust, why it's hard to partner. And so I find that in our work, Elemental has done something very unique in trying to make that top of mind and learn in public and really share as we're learning and iterating with startups. And we feel that it's extremely important to do it at the front end of your work and try to bake it in so that it's a part of your entire organization or company. And I'm more than happy to share more about our work and how we think about it at different levels, at the company founder, CEO level, like Cam, the startup level, and at the systemic level.
Yeah, and I kind of sense that, just like diving in and, looking at how you operate and, what you're trying to do in this space, it was apparent that, you need someone at the highest levels to kind of help move this forward. And I just wanted to learn a little bit more about your role. So Cameron, I'll move it over to you. You've been funded by this organization, Elemental Accelerator, and what I know is that Nancy is a partner of yours, and also Elemental Accelerator. And I just want to know about: did you have this sort of ethos and thinking around social equity and partnerships and community relations, or was it Elemental that kind of brought you into this world and or better educated? Can you just talk about that? Because I just want to learn more about how the partnership works, and then how that translates to you working with Nancy, and why that fits into your business model. Or even partnership, I guess. Yeah, business model to me sounds like such a weird word. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're a big subscriber to the Elemental ethos of community-focused development, especially with our business being focused on, we allow solar to be extended to multifamily buildings. And so that's always been very central to us, is that equity piece of making sure that everyone who wants to get access to renewable energy and reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their electricity bill can. And so that's always been kind of part of our founding values, but being aligned and partnered with Elemental has only emphasized that and augmented that and allowed us also to expand that to new markets and be able to get in touch with community leaders like Nancy to be able to kind of replicate that and tweak that in different markets. But yeah, I mean, broadly, we firmly believe that we are not going to be able to transition to a climate sort of positive industry in an equitable way and at the speed we need by just kind of selling toys to rich people. We really feel like that model has to be flipped, and we really actually designing for the community, especially in our market where we've got in the US, over a quarter of multifamily units have a household income under $20,000. Over half, almost 60%, have a household income under $50,000. So if you're not focusing on an equity component of your business, at least for us, then you're missing a really big part of the market and a big opportunity, especially with a lot of the funding opportunities that are kind of arriving now with Justice 40 and Cal Enviro Screen, kind of guiding funding in California, certainly. There's a really big, not just because it's the right thing to do, but from a commercial point of view, there's a really big opportunity in flipping this model, starting with the communities who really need the savings the most or need these solutions the most, and focusing and building a product that's designed for them as opposed to designing something for the affluent section of the population and eventually letting that trickle down. And so what's critical to actually do that is to work with people who really understand the communities that you're working with. And that's not typically what startups are very good at. Mm-hmm. And so having a relationship with and engaging with community leaders who genuinely understand those communities that you're working with is essential to make sure that your product or your offering actually fits what these community needs. Because each one is different, each community is different, and so you have to be flexible with that. But importantly, you have to engage the community leaders to make that possible. So we're firmly committed to that strategy, and it's been really successful for us in Australia. Over 65% of our installations are with affordable housing, and we're seeing some really humbling results there, where you're getting even a $20 to $30 saving a month. We've had tenants who've switched on their heating for the first time because of the savings they've got from solar, or they've been able to afford data and a Netflix account so that they can watch Netflix on their phone for the first time during the pandemic. And that customer demand really spreads quickly and can allow you to get that scale you want as a startup, but doing it from a community level. And so we plan to continue to do that and continue to work with people like Elemental and Nancy to make sure that we're doing that properly.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to go over to Nancy and just ask, so what is it like working with these folks? What is it like working with this team? I see that Esperanza is involved in health. They're involved in housing. And you have a host of wraparound services for your community, which is, I think is the way to go. I used to be in the health equity space myself, and so I have a lot of appreciation for the work you do. And what is it like working with these folks? Just want to know,
so far, absolutely. Thank you. So far, absolutely delightful. We do have a lot of different components. I would say we are in the equity and justice space. And therefore, we have all of those different components. We are largely a human rights-based organization, in the same way that we consider it a human rights violation for folks to have to choose between heating their home or food on the table. We have to be involved with health equity, housing displacement, all of the other issues that you just referred to. And so for me, I am concerned about equity for our community. We have been an environmental, we've experienced environmental racism and displacement since the disappearance of our original Tongva community, and waves of development and irresponsible, disrespectful development over the decades. So my role is to, in many ways, to look at what are generally considered universal goods, which are only truly good if they're universally accessible. And so I welcome partnering with any technological innovations that respect our community and are willing to put our frontline community issues forward and prioritize frontline people of color and their communities in this in these technology waves. I mean, we talk about the climate emergency, and certainly it is that, but we're also in a pandemic crisis. So we are dealing with communities across the lands represented in the chat here that are still dealing with rent or mortgage burden and utility burden. And so accelerating conversations at a time, even the capacity to have that conversation is not necessarily equitably distributed. So we are in it so that we can work with responsible partners and make sure that we front load the community engagement, the community co-design with technology, and the deep democracy that's necessary to move any of these agendas forward. Because as all of us know, equity will never trickle down. It has to be baked in from the get-go. And so that's why I am partnering very, very happily with Allume on this project.
Well, you said something there that I think really resonated with me is deep democracy, right? And so deep democracy to me is being in community with the folks that you're partnering with. So it's not just like swooping in, done. In many of the materials, actually, and I'll use this term again, the ethos of your website, your presentation, everything that Elemental is, you know, deep democracy kind of seems like woven in that, or community participation. It's very people focused. I didn't feel like I was on a, I don't know, it's like a very refreshing space to kind of be in. The one thing I did notice that I wanted to highlight and I want you to talk about a little bit is this idea of like paying community partners, right? So I saw that on there and I was like, all snaps, you know, because this is something movement folks have been talking about for a long time, and it's right there at the heart of your strategy. So I just want to talk, can you just talk about that for other leaders and people in this space? What does that look like? Why do you do it? And, you know, yeah, just it's very important. So if you could just like illuminate that for our audience, that'd be great.
Sure. I think it's a really important point. And I think we're pivoting into this really sort of applicable tools section of what are the things that we've learned that we think other people can just start doing and trying in community with others and really put into action now, because these are really important principles. But I think also sometimes they feel a little bit big. Where do you start? You know, how do you sort of like start this? So I think we've put a lot of thought into taking some of the things we've been trying and testing. We're always learning, of course, but some of the things that are working and sharing those in action guides and our partnerships sort of guides, and getting feedback. We want people to tell us how it's working, how it's not, how we can make it better as well. And that's what we're always doing with our companies. I will say on the paying community partners front, so, you know, Elemental, actually we have roots in Hawaii. I'm in Honolulu today, so we have a lot of our Hawaii friends here. We have 2 headquarters, one in Hawaii, Honolulu, Hawaii, one in East Palo Alto, California. We, you know, working in Hawaii or in sort of within community, I think gives you a very different lens to being an investor, sort of based on, you know, in Silicon Valley or even New York or DC or somewhere where you're sort of taking this kind of broad brush approach. Because, you know, we're sort of bumping into, one of my neighbors is one of our community partners, and you're bumping into them in the grocery store. These are community. We're all knitted together in a really specific way. In Hawaii, we live on an island, and that sort of ethos makes it really clear, I think, that as you're developing a climate project, it's not like pushing something out on your phone and thinking like, we're going to market Instagram as like this new startup and hope people download it and use it, right? These things are in people's communities. So you're talking about a new water plant, you're talking about, working with Cameron and having solar on a multifamily home. These are things that actually are things people can feel, touch, and are in their communities. And so when you're doing that and building these actual projects, putting things in people's communities, you pay your electrical contractor, you pay your general contractor, you pay maybe a law firm to help you with permitting, you pay all these different people who bring you value. And I think what has become really clear as you're deploying these projects is that community partners also bring a lot of value to the project. So you bring them in early as part of the design. It's not about sort of a community meeting later on. Here's what we're building. Like, it's all architected out. Here's all the specs. Here's the rendering of what it's going to look like. We hope you guys like it. It's 8:00 on a Tuesday. Good luck getting back to your kids for dinner. It's not about that. It's really about bringing people in early as co-designers in the process and compensating them for their expertise that they're bringing, which could include, expertise in the community. It could include trusted relationships. There's so many different elements, and so we find that to be a really important part. And I would say it's the core of our Square Partnerships model, which I think Sara may talk about next, and is one of these tools that we really want to share with all of you and want you to start testing and trying. It's pretty core to our work.
Thanks for that. And I think we dropped the toolkit in the chat for those folks that are on Crowdcast. Rachel, if we could get that out on YouTube and the other spaces, that'd be great. Really want to spread this. From the beginning, we've talked about bright spots, and I think that is a bright spot. Folks have been pushing for a while for community input to be something that is valued, and it's just really great that you're doing that, and it's kind of in your materials and just a part of your DNA. So Cameron, was this, again, I'm going to go back to you as like the partner, someone who's been working with these folks for a while. Was that new to you, or is this something that is done in Australia as well? Is that a part of the DNA of Allume, or is this something that you learned from these partners here?
I'd say it is in existence in Australia as well, where we're headquartered, but we don't quite have the same caliber of support around it that Elemental provides. And so we would, hopefully encourage Elemental to expand out there, or at least some similar ones to arrive and here down under, because it is such a critical thing. But yeah, I mean, it's always been in our DNA to do that. But it's not in the typical DNA of Australian startups, I would say, or really startups in general, to be focusing on that Square Partnerships model. I mean, there's this inherent disconnect between the mentality of startups and community-based organizations in speed. Startups want everything to be very fast and scale very fast for good reason, and they should, and they can. But if you try and create something that's just the same and you're replicating it across every community, then you will fail, because every community is very different. So you have to approach it in a slightly different way, where you're still trying to scale fast. Don't get me wrong, we're trying to grow as fast as we can, but do it by engaging the community experts, and in the case of South Central LA, with our pilots with Esperanza Community Housing and Nancy. We don't know. I mean, I'm from Australia. I don't know anything about what it's like to live in South Central LA, or like to live in affordable housing there. And so engaging with people like Nancy, who do know that, and her tenants, who certainly do know that, is really critical to make sure that we can adapt our product and our offering to actually fit that. So you do have to be adaptable, and you have to engage the right people. But if you can do those two things, and you can still grow a really rapidly growing business. But no, it's not in the typical DNA of a startup, but we like to think it's in our DNA.
And Nancy, I'll go to you now and just ask you about this. You know, I think you've been engaged with many different partners in your community. Is this something that is, maybe you've been advocating for this model where the community input is valued and compensated? Is that something that you've seen in the past? Is that more new? Are these the first folks to come to you with this sort of deep engagement?
No, actually, as an organization, that has been our model from the get-go. We're an organization that started 35 years ago, really. Our origins were in a community-based campaign against displacement of local tenants to make way for local industry. And it's appalling to me that some 35 years later, we're still in a struggle against displacement of our community. But we started along community organizing routes. So equity and the compensation and, making sure that our community not be taken for granted. Frontline communities across the terrain are usually the ones that bear the greatest risk and burden of any kind of technological change and bear the least benefit from it. We're also an organization that has been poisoned by local gas and oil extraction. So we had to learn how to deal with gas and oil, learn what it was, what the chemicals our community was being exposed to, and shut that stuff down. So throughout all of our campaigns, we are all about building power with other communities that are distressed with some of the same inflictions, and making sure that our community members are at the table in zoning decisions, co-design conversations. And in fact, the call that I was just on before this, our Leap LA coalition, was just presenting for the first time on a motion that we're introducing in the city council that will make central to a policy change around climate justice, a community advisory committee, and a community engagement policy that will lead to deep democracy. So we're trying to take these conversations and build technology. A real just transition has to bring resources that support the community expertise on the ground, which has been mentioned several times, is at least half of the important equation in these relationships. And some people are paid to be at these tables and others are not. And so I deeply appreciate those organizations that recognize that and are willing to compensate community expertise for the invaluable resource that it is. Yeah.
Great. And so the whole goal of how we're fixing it is to really unpack this stuff so that the audience understands. And so I've heard this term thrown around between you all, which is like if I get it wrong, it was called like the square, the square model? Can you talk about the square model? What does that mean so that other folks can just understand it and maybe implement it if they find it valuable for their business? I guess I'll go to Dawn.
Okay.
Yeah, Sara, I think you should take that one, and I'm happy to jump in later.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. I'm loving all the questions, Tory. I'm just soaking it in, and this is like the dream conversation where we've got our partners reflecting and thinking about what needs to work. So the Square partnerships model is a model that we've created just by learning and doing project deployment with climate tech startups. So learning and practice that projects in frontline communities aren't good projects unless they have community leadership and partnership. And we learned this early in our project deployment, and created this model to help us understand what it looks like and what it could mean to work in partnership with community-based organizations and nonprofits and compensate them as partners, shoulder to shoulder, working and designing a project together and the outcomes. together. And we've seen our projects only become better when we've got community partners who, as Cam said at the opening, know their communities the best. Nancy brings so much wisdom and expertise. They're celebrating 30 years in South Central. I mean, that's an invaluable resource. And so just knowing that is a part of the square, naming it and saying these are the partners that need to be in the room. We felt like having a model to demonstrate that is very important. The other sides of the square are the customer. So knowing that we are trying to demonstrate product market fit, which is also very hard with equity on top of that. And so making sure that the customer knows that this is in service of that final product or service. And then Elemental, we see ourselves as a really helpful, we hope, part of that square, facilitating and creating frameworks that help you think about what equity means in a business context. So, like Nancy said, these conversations aren't new. There's decades of generational wisdom and knowledge who've been leading justice issues, and we're catching up our sector. We're building trust. We're aspiring to that. And so Elemental wants to be that partner to create frameworks and support system to think about it and work through with other founders and other startups. So that's us. We want to help you think about what it is and how to behave, how to act on it. And then the last part of the square is the startup. We love entrepreneurs. They are so fascinating. They think they can solve these issues, and they can, no matter what the resources are. And they've got so much grit and so much. Dawn says this a lot. They have such a unique perspective. They see all the different ripples of society at the ground, community, policy levels. And so we know that's a really powerful network to build, especially for the type of change we're looking to make. It's extremely ambitious. So we think having those different contributors and collaborators, we can design projects that get at the heart of equity issues. What does it actually look like to provide quality of life benefits that are meaningful? And we grapple with everything in between in these projects. We talk about contracting, we talk about pay, we talk about health impacts, gentrification, unintended consequences, and we try to go directly to the topics that get at equity and justice and climate, and some of the gaps that exist in our sector that we need to unpack and start to address. So this is our attempt at that. We're trying to share it out. The link is in the chat. See where we're at, see what we're thinking about and how we're approaching it, and join us or give us feedback. And know that we are approaching this existential issue with a lot of humility and a lot of grit with the support of our partners. So that is how we think about it and what it means. It's a lot to unpack, but it's everyone in this group's a part of it.
It is a lot, but I often say that if you can make policy and kind of insider business knowledge kind of fun and exciting, I think you all are good at that. It shines through. I want to move the conversation a little bit. We haven't talked anything about from the policy angle, and I know that's a piece that is a big part of what Elemental does as well. So we have the House that's passed the Build Back Better Act, or a portion of it. And I just want to know, Dawn, what does that mean? What could that mean for the folks that you're looking to fund, the investments in the communities that you're in partnership with, and if that passes, what does that also mean for frontline communities? Because I think 40% of the dollars are to be allocated to frontline communities. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, happy to. And I think it can go one of two ways. And I think it will realistically go both ways. I think what we're seeing is that the risk is that it goes to a huge amount of resources coming into communities with people who have not necessarily have experience working in frontline communities or with community partners. And it's a little bit of a gold rush into some of these places. There's, higher tax credits, even in the infrastructure bill for working in frontline communities or traditionally excluded communities. And that's a really, really good thing. But it will also, this speed will also have some unintended consequences. So that's one thing that we're thinking a lot about with some of these acts. On the other side, this is amazing, right? It's what we've actually been advocating for, we wanted to see from a policy perspective, is centering communities first who have been impacted by environmental racism, by climate injustice in the past. So that's where there's an enormous amount of hope. We're super optimistic that this is going to be really transformative to our justice and equity goals. I think one of the things that we're thinking a lot about in that policy discussion is, what have we learned from the other ways that we've done this, particularly in California? There's been a lot of effort here, also in Hawaii and many other local jurisdictions, and we've learned a lot. So how can we pass those learnings on as quickly as possible and really support equitable and thoughtful rollout of these programs? So one example is that at Elemental, we've been doing policy work for the entire time that we've been around. My background is actually in policy. I have sort of a weak spot there. And policy intersects so much with climate. It sets sort of the rural framework. In the 5 sectors that we work in are energy, water, mobility, transportation, food and agriculture, and then materials and circular economy. So all 5 of those, there's a huge regulatory component from the government. Government's a big customer and often even the sort of service provider or regulated service provider in those industries. And so government has to be a real key partner of this. And then earlier this year, we launched a policy lab to specifically fund fellows. We're actually looking for more fellows. We've funded 5 so far, specifically fund fellows who can learn from entrepreneurs and what's happening on the ground in communities, and then translate that through writing, through thought leadership, through white papers, through advocacy, into policies that make a lot of sense at the federal, state, and local level. So we see this, again, as just a treasure trove of information and learning coming out of the real deployments on the ground. And that's what policymakers are hungry for. What's amazing is that they're actually asking us, we're passing these laws. Do you have ways that we can do this that are like really compelling and can work? So they're super hungry for this information. So that's part of why we started the policy lab, to really connect those dots, to shorten the distance between policymakers and the square, the community partner, the customer, the funder, investor, which could be us or someone else, and the startup, and shorten the distance between that learning and the policymaker. So that's how we think about policy here. And last thing I guess I'll just mention about it is that we have a framework that Sara has really led on our team, along with our partners at Greenlining Institute and others, that is about both what you're doing internally as a human, a person who shows up in the world, the work you're doing there, the work you're doing on your team. And we call it equity in. The work on your team, people think of it as diversity, equity, and inclusion. How are the people on your team actually reflecting the communities in which you're working? And then this equity out portion, which is what we've been talking about with square partnerships, which is how do you actually partner in communities? And these two actually have to work in sync. They're deeply related. Very difficult to do meaningful community partnership work without doing work internally to understand your own history and context, where you come from, how your team is made up, the biases that you bring to the table, which we all do. And so that's, I think, part of what we're really thinking about as we think about policy, is it's not just about how this will be deployed or how this law is written on the ground, but it's about the internal work we do that prepares us to be effective and trustworthy partners too.
Great, really appreciate that. Well, it's crazy how fast the time moves in these Zoom rooms or Crowdcast or whatever, these spaces. But we've entered the part of the discussion where we're going to have a Q&A. So there's a few questions here. Feel free to, Rachel, who's working behind the scenes with us, if you want to drop some of the questions in the chat here, I can see them that way if they're coming from YouTube, Twitter, or wherever. But for now, I'll start with these questions that are here. The first one is, can you give some examples of how these tools have worked in Hawaii? I guess I'll go to Sara for that.
Oh yeah,
There you
I
go.
can start that. And then Dawn, feel free to chime in. So our Equity and Access program kind of started building out in California. So we have much more kind of proof points and partnerships based in California. And we're expanding it this year into every company's project across our entire cohort. And we have really exciting projects happening this year. And we have one that we like to share out in particular that is from this past year, actually, during the pandemic, with our portfolio company, Cambrian, and their partner, Vi. And we saw community leadership play out here on wastewater issues, where Cambrian has a solution that helps with clean water and helps to kind of pinpoint issues with wastewater pollution. And I came in with history and context of the impact of that technology very early to help Cambrian understand the context of Hawaii and some of the issues that were close to the community. And as we expand into the Equity and Access program, we're looking for more partners and more folks that are interested in working with us. But Dawn, if you have any other thoughts, I'd love to open it up.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of startup examples that we can share and different ways that community partners have plugged in. Sometimes it's really closely oriented with the customer, like you sort of see with Allume and Esperanza, where there's a real tie between the community partner and the customer in sort of direct deployment. We can drop a link to our Remix Transform case study as well, which is really about integrating community voice into design and kind of to some of the things, Nancy, you were talking about of how do you think about design and get as early in the process as possible. We actually funded that project to build equity into planning tools for cities. It's now being rolled out all over the world. And so really building those tools in early. I think the last one I'll just highlight of how it's worked in Hawaii is where we've been trying to expand this community partnership model to other sectors in climate as well. One of the really key pieces of our work that Sara also leads is related to our education work. So we see an enormous appetite to work in climate from young people. Last year, we saw 1,385 applications for internships for a handful of internships across the portfolio, and just this enormous wave of interest. So one of the things that we did this year around the community partnership model is to work with Teach for America and some of their teachers from particularly underrepresented communities or mostly Native Hawaiian communities in Hawaii, and bring the high schoolers and the teachers into summer internships or externships with Elemental to get a sense of what would it mean to have a climate career? What would those look like? And these are kids that have just unbelievable passion around this issue, but didn't have a clear sense of how would I build the steps to a career in this space, because it can feel kind of abstract. And just saw some incredible results from working in partnership there with the community partner, very hand in hand with startups, and with Elemental as well. So really, we think about this in terms of how businesses deploy and scale and build this into their DNA. We're also thinking about it in terms of how educators build this into their DNA as well, and using a really similar playbook in Hawaii and across California, and now globally, to do the same thing.
Great, thanks for that. I didn't know that part about your relationships, and I didn't even know that it was a part of your program. So I'm learning as well. This next question is a question that actually popped into my head at one point. And so Shiva Patel asks, in regard to ownership structure of the startups that are partnering with communities, are there options for communities to own equity in these startups? This seems like a very, I'll go back to Dawn with this one.
Yeah, and Cameron, I would love your thoughts here too. It's been an active conversation, I would say, among our portfolio companies. Every year we convene our portfolio companies to share learnings and best practices. And this one has come up quite a bit as CEOs are talking to each other and thinking about creating pools of equity. And we have, I would say, a couple of experiments underway, and we're tracking closely what that looks like. Some of the key considerations that have come up in this conversation are, how do you choose the community partner that would receive the equity? And then how do you distribute that in an equitable way? And is it better to receive cash now in, really around sort of like the payment for services value, or sort of take that risk and of growing with the startup over time that the equity will pay out? What is the relative value of those two things in terms of payment now, payment later? Could you do both? What would that look like? There's also some conversations about, creating community advisory boards. A couple of companies in our space have done that and provided some equity to people on those community advisory boards. That's another way to do it. Hello. But then how do you decide who's on those boards, and there, as you sort of make that decision? So there's some of the, I would say, 3 or 4 of the considerations that have come up when our CEOs are swapping notes on this. And the experiment's underway. I think as they mature, we would love to share learnings there in a couple of different pathways that seem to be working, and maybe some things even to avoid. But Cameron, is that something that you guys have thought about a little bit?
To be honest, no, but we'd be interested in it. I think, it would have to be quite a sort of replicable thing, because the nature of community partnerships, you want to partner with many because you want that community partner to intimately know the particular community. My assumption, and I'm keen to get Nancy's thoughts on this, is that cash would be a better compensation for community-based organizations, but perhaps that's not the case. But what would you think, Nancy?
Well, if as the question is posed, I'd immediately think about convening a discussion with a number of tenants and see what works well. I would be an intermediary in this case. I'd help to convene the group, but I would not give you an answer. I know there are lots of emergencies. We are also giving a tremendous amount of thought as to how do we approach our tenants at this particular moment, when we know on top of rent and utility insecurity, folks are also food insecure. So we would need to really, the kind of housing that we provide is really the last stable housing before resorting to homelessness. To provide, we serve very, very low income families. And so we would have conversations that would first ask what the basic needs were and what this kind of new technology would mean to them. And if there was a possibility of serving as a partner in this particular way, what would be the greatest investment that would be of value to them? I think that, part of frontline communities is that they haven't been asked the questions yet. So we start with that.
That's right. Great, thanks. So we have about 3 minutes left. I don't think we have enough time to squeeze in one more question. So I'm just going to go to closing out with everyone here on the call. Call, space, Zoom, whatever you want to call it. The first thing I want to say is just thank you so much to all the folks here in this space. I really appreciate this. I learned a ton. I hope the audience learned a ton. And to do some housekeeping, just want to plug that Dawn is going to have a TED Talk that is going to be coming out in just like next week. So you can, I think, go to their website, Elemental Accelerator, and look for that. Follow them on Twitter, and I'm sure it will be announced there and on their other social spaces. So the other thing I would say is like this. GRIST, the organization, we're a nonprofit media organization. So one of the reasons I joined this organization is because there's no paywall. That's like a big thing for me. Like if we're trying to tackle these many crises that are happening in our democracy, whether it be the democracy itself or the climate crisis, I don't think that a paywall helps because it's putting a wall between information and the public, and that's not what the news is here for. So, if the members who support GRIST, thank you so much for your support. We can't do it without you. I know that sounds like that's like the line, but like it's truly true. And I just, want to say thank you so much for that. We have moments like this. We'll have many more like this, and we'll continue to unpack what hopeful climate solutions look like. And I think that Elemental Accelerator, their partners, are a really solid example of that. So really appreciate just the support that we've been given. And so the last thing I'll close out with, because we are close to our end of year, if you have money that you'd like to give, go to grist.org and hit that donate button and just help us keep this, conversations like this flowing and make it so that we'll never have our paywall. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for being with us, and
thank you.
We look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to the GRIST team.
Thank you, Nancy.
Bye. Hope to talk to you soon.